Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our webinar, Wildscaping with Kerry Wixted. I see that you're all coming into the meeting here, so we're going to wait a few minutes while everybody arrives. We've got more than 700 of you who wanted to attend and hear what Kerry has to tell us today, so this is going to be quite exciting. And as you're coming in, if you want to see this beautiful slideshow that the Multi-Faith Alliance of Climate Stewards has put together, you have a little thing in the top right hand of your picture or your profile that has a bunch of little blocks, and that's your view. And you can play around with that and change the view so you can see that slideshow better and have speakers and things like that to the right side of your screen or the top of your screen so you can see things. So go ahead and try that. Also, as you're coming in, we'd love to know where you're from. And maybe you were out in your garden and you've planted something today. So why don't you drop a little note in the chat if you feel like it and let us know where you're coming from, what you're growing this year. And we will have the chat open at the beginning of this webinar, but we are going to be turning it off because there are so many of us. And once we do turn it off, we are going to go only for question and answer, which is a little balloon in your bar that is your Zoom bar. So right now you should be able to see the ability to put in the chat, and then you see Q&A in your Zoom bar, and that's what you'll be using during Kerry's presentation. And we do encourage you to ask questions. So if you want to go ahead and, just jump into the chat there and let us know before we start while everyone's coming in, we welcome you to do that. There's another function of the question and answer while you're listening that we wanted to tell you about, and that is called the upvote. And we know lots of us have the same question, so we encourage you to look at the Q&A, and you might want to click on that right now just so you can see how it looks. And you'll see other people's questions posted in that question and answer. And if you would like to click the little like button and say, I like that question, that means more people will drive that question to the top of the pile, so to speak, and that means that question will get answered sooner because we probably won't have time to get to every single question. So please feel free to do that. So keep on coming in. We're still waiting for more people to arrive. We've already got 300 of you here, so you're quite a crowd, and we're excited to have more of you. So we'll be starting in just a minute or so. And it's a beautiful slideshow that's been put together of native plants from around Maryland, which is what Kerry is going to be talking about primarily today, but probably many of you are from outside of Maryland, so we welcome you and hope that you'll enjoy hearing about our flora and fauna. So go ahead and drop your name in the chat if you like, and where you're from, if you want to talk anything about what you've planted this beautiful spring weekend, and we'll be starting in just a minute. We've got quite a few of you here at the webinar. So welcome to our webinar today. If you've just joined us, we're waiting for everybody to come into the chat here, please, or into the webinar. So lots of people are putting where they're from in the chat. So we welcome you to do that. If you want to say something about what you've planted this weekend, and we'll be starting in just a moment. So we have got quite a number of you in, so we will go ahead and get ourselves moving for the webinar here, and hopefully the rest of the team is ready. So I would like to welcome everyone. I am Linda Norris-Waldt, and I'm the Executive Director of Envision Frederick County. And we are a nonprofit organization here in Frederick County, Maryland. And we are dedicated to the environmental, social, and economic vitality of our community, and also to producing engaged citizens who can fight for that economic and environmental vitality. So we're really thrilled to be here today, and we are happy to tell you about the Multi-Faith Alliance of Climate Stewards, and you're going to hear about what they do shortly. So one last time, I'll let you know, go ahead and put some info in the chat, which we're going to be turning off once the webinar starts officially, when we'll be using the question and answer function. So at this time, I am going to formally turn this over to Bernadette Roche from the Multi-Faith Alliance of Climate Stewards. Take it away, Bernadette.
Hi, thank you, Linda. Welcome, everybody. We're so glad you're here with us. We're going to be streaming this event live on Facebook on our MAX Facebook page in case you have friends that didn't register on time, so they can watch it there without a registration link. So I want to tell you about MAX, the Multi-Faith Alliance of Climate Stewards. We address climate issues, climate-related issues in Frederick County, Maryland. It's a grassroots organization that started in early 2016 as a collaborative response among many faith communities that were really already starting to rally on important climate concerns. When we're not running events such as the 2019 Climate Conference or the recent Doug Tallamy lecture, and even today's talk by Kerry Wixted, we're promoting and joining other events, such as StreamLink's tree plantings or the push for stronger environmental legislation in Frederick County. For example, the Forest Restoration Ordinance or the Climate Emergency Resolution, which both passed last year by the Frederick County Council. Or at the state level, for example, the Maryland Environmental Human Rights Campaign. We know we're stronger together, and we welcome you to join us to participate either as individuals or congregations. Please email maxfrederickcounty@yahoo.com, and we'll drop that in the chat to join, and let us know a little bit about yourself. Our webinar today is climate related too. In addition to their many benefits to our functioning ecosystems, native plants sequester carbon for longer than non-native plants, and thus help to mitigate the effects of climate change. To start our webinar today, because it so powerfully connects us to the land we spend our lives on, I want to respectfully acknowledge the Piscataway Conoy people, and before them, the Montgomery Complex. These First Nations recognize the richness of our soils and bounty of our forests in Frederick County. My co-lead for MAX, Linda Coyle, will introduce Kerry Wixted in just a minute. In the meantime, I'd like to offer this Hawaiian prayer. Let us give thanks for the world around us. Thanks for all the creatures, stones, and plants. Let us learn their lessons and seek their truths so that their paths might be ours, and we might live in harmony, a better life. May the earth continue to live. May the heavens above continue to live. May the rains continue to dampen the land. May the wet forests continue to grow. Then the flowers shall bloom and we people shall live again. And so now my co-lead of MAX, Linda Coyle, will introduce Kerry Wixted.
Okay, before I do that, thank you to everyone for introducing yourselves and where you're from. To minimize distractions, Bernadette is going to now turn off the chat, but you, like Linda Norris told you, you can put your questions in the Q&A, and if you see one you like, just click on the like button, the thumbs up button, and it will move it up the list. So, like Bernadette said, my name is Linda Coyle, and I would like to acknowledge the other members of the team that put this webinar together. That would be Debbie Sartorius, Ann Payne, Arusa Khan, Bernadette Roche, and me. We also researched the nurseries in the area to find out who sells natives, and we'll be sharing a slide about that at the end of the program. So now let's get on with the program. I'm so happy to introduce Kerry Wixted to you. Kerry is the Education and Outreach Specialist for the Wildlife and Heritage Service within the Maryland Department of Natural Resources. She has worked there for 12 years, and especially in education, but also in the Maryland Natural Heritage Program. She runs several statewide programs such as Project Wild for professional development for educators and the Wild Acres Backyard Wildlife Habitat Program. I've been in classes with Kerry that she has taught for master naturalists and for educators, and have always left happy, inspired, and a bit more confident in my knowledge of nature. She makes it fun. I thank you for being here tonight, Kerry, to teach us how to wildscape with native plants. And I'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Linda. And I'm so excited to be here and to see this huge level of interest in ways to essentially wildscape your landscapes. So how exciting. And this is the perfect time. I was out in the garden earlier today, getting everything in and changing stuff up and all of that. So I'm very happy to be here, and I will say I had a really tough time selecting just 10 plants. So some of them are kind of groups of plants that I'll talk about, but there's so many more than what I have the time to cover tonight. So my name again is Kerry Wixted, and I work with the Maryland Department of Natural Resources within the Wildlife and Heritage Service. So we manage the state's wildlife resources, the ducks and the bucks and everything else in between, including lots of our birds and butterflies and all sorts of other things. And one of the programs that I run across the state is called Wild Acres, and it's all about backyard wildlife habitat. So if you like this information and you want more, please check out our Wild Acres program online. So I probably don't have to tell you why we need wildlife friendly landscapes, especially since you're hanging out on a Sunday night. But when you look at changes in regional land cover across different places and things like that, this is just a statistic from NOAA's recent regional land cover report. You can see that a lot of forests and wetlands and places like that are declining across the eastern United States. And of course, when you look at the full picture across the world, this is happening, and we're having more land that's getting locked up in backyards. It's estimated that almost 40 million acres are locked up in lawn right now here in the United States. And there's a lot of potential for creating that habitat and making it wildlife friendly instead of just that monoculture of a lawn. So the important thing to remember too is that our healthy landscapes need insects. And if you have been a fan of Dr. Doug Tallamy, and I certainly have been over the years, he really hits home the importance of supporting food webs and not just, putting out bird feeders to attract those birds. You really want to think about supporting their life cycle, because if you're interested in things like songbirds, the majority of our songbirds around here rear their young on insects. They need soft-bodied protein and fat like caterpillars and other types of insects to be able to feed their young. It doesn't matter how much bird seed you put out there, it's not going to support that reproduction phase. And so Dr. Doug Tallamy and his various research students and things like that have done a lot of work, especially on the local landscapes, looking at the impacts of insects and non-native plants on birds. And this is a graphic from Dr. Desiree Narango, who just recently graduated from his lab. And she looked at chickadees, Carolina chickadees, in suburban yards in Prince George's County in Washington, D.C. And she found the magic number for non-native plants, or the percentage of non-native plants, is actually around 30%. If you had more than 30% non-native plants in a backyard, the success of chickadees to breed and successfully reproduce significantly started to decline the more non-native plants you had. And all of that comes back to those birds, because those non-native plants are not supporting the same numbers of insects as the native plants. And so they're spending more energy to forage more and things like that, and having to travel farther and everything to get the energy that they need. And that starts affecting their ability to successfully reproduce. So we have to think about the whole landscape and these sensitive food webs that are kind of coming together when we're planting for wildlife. So the first step in all of this is to know your habitat. And I know a lot of you are joining in from Maryland. I always like to show this graphic. These are the physiographic provinces of Maryland. And essentially, this is how we split up Maryland based on different climates in terms of the weather, and then also the underlying geology and things like that. So I'm down in Anne Arundel County, so I'm part of the coastal plain. But when I did all of my research research and everything, I was out in the Appalachian Plateau province. And so out there, it's a lot colder. They just got snow this past weekend. So that's really surprising because it's been kind of warmed down my way in Anne Arundel County. And so, so when they have those differences in the temperature and the soils, that's going to affect the plant communities, which ultimately is going to affect the animal communities that are supported. But I'm showing you this map mainly so you kind of know your province for selecting certain plants to put out in your landscapes, because the plants that I fell in love with out in the mountain region and Allegheny Mountain section, not all of them survive down in the coastal plain. And when I first got my yard, I was trying to plant them and then I just watched them die because it was a little too hot and our soils are a little too sandy and acidic to support some of those species. Now, there certainly are plants that are going to thrive across the state. So a lot of the suggestions that I've built into tonight's presentation are going to be kind of across the board, can grow in different habitats across the state. But just keep that in mind. So know your location, know what your goals are. So do you want to support songbirds? Are you interested in butterflies or bees or other wildlife species? Some people love squirrels, right? So, you know, who do you want to attract? Are there any target species that you want to bring in? And that should be factored into your goals there. So, and also keep in consideration family and pets and how you're going to use these landscapes in addition to how you're going to create that wildscape. The other important thing is to know more about the actual site you're planting in. So a lot of people are like, I want to attract butterflies. What do I plant? And then I have to ask them, well, is your area sunny? Is it shady? What's the soil like? Is it acidic? Is it clayey? Does it hold water really well, or is it super dry? I mean, all that's really going to factor into what plants are going to be supported by your habitat. So one of the best things I always suggest is getting a soil test and getting that done to find out a little bit more about your soil, like the pH profiles and maybe some nutrients or things like that that might be limited in your landscape. If you need to build up your soil or something like that, that's going to help you. So getting that soil test is going to be a great first step. And also know that some parts of your landscape might be different. So my front yard's shady. It has amazing like loamy soil. And it's so different from my backyard, which is separated by like 15, 20 feet, where it's full sun in my backyard and the builders scraped off the entire topsoil. So all they left me was that coastal plain clay. So what grows in my backyard is different than what grows in my front yard. So that's also something to keep in mind. Moving along to the next step is to make a plan. And I highly suggest starting out small. So no matter what size habitat you have, try to chunk it up and think about those goals and different steps that you'll take along the way. So for me, when I got my first yard 10 years ago, I had a lot of invasive plants in my yard, and I'll talk about them on the next slide. So my first goal was to get rid of the invasive plants. That was my number one goal. And then I was slowly replacing them with native plants. And I would select different areas. So you can see down here, my section where I carved out some landscape for my butterfly garden. And so this was a nice manageable goal for a year for me. And it all depends on how much time and how much money you have and how fast you want to get these things done. So, so keep that in mind. But as a busy person, I have to do it in small sections. And what's nice about chunking it up in small sections, that allows me to test plants out. And essentially what I say that is, you know, I can recommend great plants for your habitat and landscape, but the microclimates with your soil, there might be some things that just don't make those plants thrive in your environment. And I don't want to see people spend a lot of time and money installing plants and having them die. So essentially, I have this picture of golden Alexanders. This is one of the recent plants that I added to my landscape last year. And I only planted 3 because I wanted to see how they did in my environment. And this year they are almost blooming right now and they're doing fantastic. They've actually seeded in, and I have double the amount of golden Alexanders than I started with last year. So that gives me a sign that this is a plant that's going to do well in my landscape. And I've already purchased some more to essentially use. Another thing to keep in mind in terms of creating your habitat and your goals and all of that, think about planting in clumps. So this is the best for wildlife because they're going to spend less energy moving from plant to plant, especially if they're using a single plant like a milkweed species for monarchs. You know, those caterpillars have to walk a long distance. If they have to walk a long distance from milkweed to milkweed, that's going to affect their ability to grow and reproduce and all of that. So keeping it all together is going to help them out. And aesthetically, it also looks nice having those plants in clumps too. Last thing I'm going to suggest is consider your deer or other animals like groundhogs while you're making your plans, and also think about your neighbors. So keep all of that in mind. I have lots of deer in my backyard. So this is one of my deer right there. She was checking out my tomatoes that I had to cage up to keep her off of. And I have a really chubby groundhog. So those are 2 considerations I have before I select certain species and plant them in my yard: how deer resistant they are and how groundhog resistant they are. So keep that in mind, and then also keep in mind your neighbors. And a lot of times I suggest, especially if you're in a densely populated area, putting up signage like, these different wildlife habitat signs to let your neighbors know your intentions and what you're doing. Talk to them, bring them in, so show them the butterflies that are visiting and kind of tell them about your plans before you just start completely changing the landscape. And then also, if you're in an area where maybe people might have some problems with some of these larger native plants and all of that, consider making your gardens really intentional. So putting up, mulching around the edges or borders or things like that, just so it doesn't seem so wild, and it shows them that you're doing this intentionally to help wildlife and things. All right, so my next suggestion is to remove invasives. And invasives are non-native plants or organisms that cause problems. And these problems can be economic, they can be ecological, or they can be human health related. So some of these plants kind of fit multiple categories. A good example of that is Japanese barberry, which is often used in landscapes because it's a pretty evergreen, and it has really, fancy looking berries. But that Japanese barberry is attractive to deer mice and ticks, and deer also like it. So when you get high concentrations of Japanese barberry in forest landscapes, you get a lot of higher densities of ticks and higher amounts of Lyme disease in those ticks. So that's a human health problem. Not to mention that barberry is edging out a lot of our native plants in those forest understories and creating ecological problems as well. So my suggestion for some of these invasive plants, at least for my goals and my habitat, is to target those that are going to spread beyond your yard first. So think about ones that have wind dispersed seeds or animal dispersed seeds. For example, barberry has those fleshy fruits, and those are often moved around by birds and other organisms. So they're going to plant it in your neighbor's yard. Butterfly bush is a species that has wind dispersed seeds, and it can travel quite a distance before it actually sets up in other areas. Now, butterfly bush is super attractive to butterflies, but if you remember what I said earlier, attracting isn't the same as supporting. When we look at the nectar content of butterfly bush, it's not that good in terms of it doesn't have lots of minerals and nutrients. It's mostly sucrose. It doesn't have a lot of things that butterflies need for their reproduction and all of that. In addition, butterfly bush doesn't support the caterpillars of any of our local butterfly or moth species. So it's not a host plant, and it's not supporting the life cycle. And it's also moving around. So my neighbor several houses down has a butterfly bush in their front yard. And last year I found butterfly bush seedlings in my backyard, and it had to have come from their plant or maybe somebody else's plant here in the neighborhood. But just goes to show you that these things can travel outside your yard and you might not realize it. So check out websites like the Maryland Invasive Species Council, and that will help you with determining what plants are considered to be invasive. And if you're outside of Maryland, then check out some of the other, like check out your state or local invasive species council, because they probably have similar lists. For those of you that have lawn and you're trying to convert your lawn into natural environments, there are a couple different methods that you can utilize. So something like sheet mulching, which is pictured here, is an example. So taking things like cardboard and newspaper and all of that, and essentially smothering it and using that to kind of kill off that grass slowly. You want to cut your grass down as low as you can before you do any of these methods that I'm going to recommend, and that will help in terms of getting rid of that grass faster. You can also use a lasagna method, where essentially you're cutting your grass short, you're putting that cardboard, and then you put things like mulch or soils over top. So you've got those different layers, like layers in lasagna. And there's different ways that you can make your lasagna layers for your lawn. You can also use things like black plastic if it's a really sunny area, and there's a term called solarization, where it heats it up underneath that black plastic and essentially kills that grass underneath. But you need to be in an area that gets a lot of sunlight and gets nice and toasty for that to work. So there are different websites that will help you and help you with that removal of the lawn. And again, do it in patches, see what works, and continue on once you know what works. So those are all of my suggestions there. So now we're going to get into my 10 different native plants that I suggest. So, so again, these are just some of my top suggestions, and it really depends on your landscape, your habitat, and your goals of which will work out. So a lot of people ask me about native ground covers, and golden ragwort is one of my favorite ground covers that you can put out there. So this is a semi-evergreen plant, and so it depends on where you're at, whether or not those leaves will persist through the winter. So this past winter, I'm in the coastal plain in Anne Arundel County, so all of my leaves stayed up and were nice and green, and the plants are flowering right now, and they're doing fantastic. So this can be a very aggressive plant. So this is a picture from a local master gardener, and you can see all of that yellow is that golden ragwort that she planted in there. It's just a beautiful plant in these landscapes. It can thrive in full sun or in shade. And it can also thrive in wet or dry conditions. But the sunnier it is, the more it likes that wet environment. So just make sure that if you have it in full sun, that the soil is kind of moist and not too dry. Otherwise, it might not do well. So in some people's yards, this plant can be super aggressive, and it might even be good at choking out invasive plants like lesser celandine and garlic mustard. So it's recommended sometimes to use this to fight plants with plants in a sense. And so for me, this plant hasn't taken off really fast in my backyard, but it's starting to. So I'm kind of happy to see it spread and everything like that. But yes, you know, this is a good plant to put out there if you've got those conditions and you're looking for a ground cover that's going to spread around. The next plant I'm going to talk about is a vine, and this is trumpet honeysuckle, and I adore this plant. So I inherited a trumpet honeysuckle with the house, and it was in a pot with a trellis on the back porch, and it was fantastic because this blooms almost continuously April through October, and it's a hummingbird feeder you don't have to clean, which is really nice. So, and it has these gorgeous flowers, and it can get really thick and dense in the right conditions and all of that. So this is attractive to hummingbirds, and also the hummingbird moths, like the snowberry clearwings and things like that. They're actually going to feed on the leaves. So this is a host plant for some of those moth species. And I had never seen those hummingbird moths in my yard when I had this up on my deck. But when we had to move the plant down by the garden, when we were getting some work done on our deck, the hummingbird clearwings must have found it, because I started noticing holes all in my leaves, and then I started seeing the adults a month later. It was just amazing how quickly they found it. But the hummingbirds definitely are really good at finding it, even up on the porch and all of that. And when it got moved, I remember having the hummingbirds kind of like look around and like, where did it go? And they've been looking for it. So unfortunately, when it moved, it got broken. So it wasn't as big and as lustrous last year as it has been, but I'm hoping this year it will bounce back. So this is a plant that is best in full sun, but it can take some parts shade. So if you want it to be nice and bushy, it's going to be in that full sun. And if you have a friend with this, you can actually take cuttings of it and use that root hormone, and that'll actually help it with establishing. So you don't have to buy a plant if you don't want to. Moving along to goldenrods, this is a really big group of plants. So, so there are goldenrods that are that essentially bloom early in the spring, some that are mid-season and some that are late. There's some that are well behaved, and there's some that are super aggressive. Some like shade and some like full sun. So no matter where you are, there's a goldenrod out there for you. And so I love this plant because it's just, you know, or this group, they support a lot of butterfly and moth species, over 115 species actually host on the solidagos or the goldenrods. And there are some specialist bees that also use goldenrods for their nectar and for their pollen. The late season goldenrods, the ones that bloom later in the year, are also really important for migrating monarchs because they're providing that food and essentially fuel for them to continue their southward migration. And so if you're in a coastal area, some of the seaside goldenrod is an excellent late season nectar source for those migrating monarchs. Now, I have two species up on the screen. So blue-stemmed goldenrod is one that likes that shady environment. So I have it planted in my front yard. It's not a very aggressive goldenrod. It's smaller, but it brings in a lot of different insects, including beneficial wasp, like this sand wasp right here. And if I'm remembering correctly, I think this is the species that actually likes to eat stink bugs. So, so you can bring in your own pest control by planting out in these goldenrods. And there are a lot of other beneficial wasps. Most of them are solitary wasps that are attracted to goldenrod, that aren't aggressive. They're not going to really want to sting you, but they're going to want to eat a lot of insects in your yard. And so it's free pest control in that regard. So the other goldenrod on the other side of the screen, the wrinkle-leaved, and sometimes people call it rough goldenrod. This is an aggressive goldenrod that likes full sun. So you're going to find this in sunny areas and fields and backyards and all of that. I had some that seeded into my yard several years ago, and I was like, sweet, free plants, and really excited. But I got to work hard to keep this from not taking over my entire backyard because it is really good at kind of coming in and just taking over. I was just poking around in the pollinator garden today, and I was like, well, I think I'm going to have to dig out some of that goldenrod because it's essentially taking it all over right now. But for some people, you like it. That's what you want, because you might not have a lot of money to purchase a lot of plants, and you just want to put something out there that's going to take over. So it really, again, goes back to your goals and everything. But these are excellent plants. And then the other nice thing is I suggest leaving up the stalks from the fall through the winter, because some of our native bees will use those flower stalks. And also there are things like gall flies and moths that will actually overwinter in the stems. And so, so you'll see these little bulges on your goldenrods. those aren't something for concern. It's just a little insect inside there that's living and growing. And then I've watched some of our sparrows go and peck at them, at those galls, and actually extract those insect larvae in the middle of the winter. So they're getting some fat and protein, and they know the goldenrod's where they go to get all that food. So last thing I'll say about goldenrod, when I teach insect classes, I always take people to the goldenrod patches just because they're just teeming with life and all sorts of awesome things on them. All right, so some other asters. The Asteraceae family is a very large family of plants. And so this is kind of how I got past the just choosing 10 plants, because I figured I could talk about a couple different asters under that, that umbrella there. So asters like black-eyed Susans and coneflowers. Excuse me, the black-eyed Susans are obviously our Maryland state flower, and the purple coneflowers are actually a non-native here in Maryland, but they're really easy to find, easy to grow, easy to maintain. So, and they're not invasive, and they attract a lot of different insects, including some of our bigger bee species and things like that. And then the seeds are really good for our finches in the fall. So if you are like me and you have kind of a black thumb when it comes to growing some of these plants, black-eyed Susans and coneflowers are a really safe bet to go with, because they are very hard to not thrive, to not get to thrive. And they're pretty cheap to find. So they are really good at starting from seed and transplanting out there and everything. They're easy to transplant the seedlings too. So they're really just a good gateway plant to kind of get you into native plant gardening. And a lot of them will also work in pots. So if you have a small landscape or you're looking for something that might work on a deck, then these plants might work for you. So whitewood aster and New England aster are asters that are going to bloom late in the fall. And so just like those late blooming goldenrods, these are going to be very important plants for migrating monarchs and also for a lot of different species in the fall, where they really need that nectar and pollen when it can be limiting. Whitewood aster does best in full shade, and it is self-seeding, so it can spread and really fill in certain areas. So this is a good plant to put out there if you need something to kind of spread around. Then New England aster is, so there's New England and New York aster, and they bring these really pretty pops of purples and fuchsias essentially to the garden late in the season, and they can bloom as late as October. So they can be some nice, nice plants to add for some late season color and also for those nectar and pollen resources. Blue mist flower, I really need to take a better picture. This was a wild one, so it looks a little scraggly, but it's a gorgeous plant in the garden, and this picture doesn't do it justice. But this is a plant that's going to bloom in late summer, and it can also thrive in part shade to full shade. So it's another one that brings a pop of color and brings in a lot of insects. And all of these plants, if you leave them up, they're going to produce seeds that are going to feed our different birds. And then some of our native bee species will actually nest in the stems and overwinter in the stems. So leave them up until this time of year and then cut them down and put them off to the side of your yard, and you'll keep that habitat essentially year round for those species. Last plant that I want to put up is Blazing Star, aka Liatris. So this is a group of plants, and I feel like they're really underrated in the landscape. So these are plants that do best in full sun, and they love crappy soil. So remember when I said I've got full-on clay out back, and it doesn't have a lot of like topsoil or anything good in it. Well, Blazing Star works really good in that crappy soil. So Blazing Star naturally will grow along roadsides and ditches and things like that. We have some Blazing Star species that actually grow at Soldier's Delight, which is a serpentine barren, just to give you an idea how hardy this plant is. And it has like almost like a bulb-like rhizome, so it's easy to transplant and all of that. It is a really pretty plant. It has these purplish pinkish flowers that kind of are in a very tall stalk, and essentially it is attractive to our different solitary wasp, like this thread-waisted wasp. And so this is another species that is really good at eating pest insects, but is not a problematic species where it's going to be aggressive and attack you and everything like that. So I love them. They're really big wasp, but most of our wasp species are really tiny. So. All right, moving on to some of our mints. And these are other plants that I suggest often for beginners. And essentially the reasons for that is they're easy to grow, they're easy to find, and you can start them from seed. So there's a lot of different benefits to them. And they're also highly beneficial to a lot of our pollinator species. So if you have kind of wet soils and full sun or part sun, then bee balm is an excellent plant. This is another one of those hummingbird favorite plants. And just look how gorgeous that plant is. I adore bee balm. I do not have the wet soil that would support bee balm, so I have its cousin wild bergamot in my yard. So this is a picture from my yard and one of my bumblebees enjoying it. So this isn't as attractive to the hummingbirds because of the color difference, but it brings in a lot of bumblebees and also those solitary wasp. Another one that's great is the spotted bee balm. And if you have really sandy soil, this can grow in sandy soil. It can also grow in old ag fields and things like that. So it's one that doesn't need a lot of nutrients in the soil to grow and thrive. And it's so pretty. Like it looks like something out of a Dr. Seuss novel to me. This is one I just recently added to my landscape. It's a little shorter than the wild bergamot, and I think they mix very well because the bergamot's much taller than the bee balm. So you get those different structures and layers in your garden. The last one are the mountain mints. And mountain mint is a group. So the three other species are in the Monarda genus, but mountain mint is in Pycnanthium genus. And there's several species in mountain mints. And some of them are shade or some of them are full sun, wet and dry. So there's a mountain mint out there for you. And in Penn State pollinator trials, this came out #1 in terms of bringing in the diversity of insects and all sorts of things. So I can attest to that in my garden. It is amazing what really like comes in. We'll have bees and wasps and butterflies and even the little pollinating flies, the flower flies and things like that are all over those mountain mint. It sounds like it's buzzing with life because it really is. There's bringing in so many different things. I planted it on the side of my driveway, and when I was, going to work and all of that, I'd come home and I'd just get lost for like 15-20 minutes just staring at all the things that were visiting the mountain mint. And then my husband was like, come on, Kerry, come inside. It's time for dinner. Because I would just be so distracted and so excited about everything that's there. So all of these species are going to seed in and spread in yards. And the mountain mint's the only one that, that sometimes can take a little bit more muscle to kind of get out. So the bee balms and the bergamots have really shallow root systems and are really easy to pull out if they get around into spots that you don't really want. If you want mountain mint, but you don't want to control it, consider placing it in a pot. So that might be a good alternative. Or if you have a small landscape and you can only put out, things in planters, then consider putting a planter of mountain mint out. And much like those coneflowers and those asters, leave these stems up through the fall because there are native bees that will nest inside of them through the winter. Moving on to our milkweeds, I had to do a slide of milkweeds because this is what the monarchs host their eggs on. So this is what they lay their caterpillars on. Lay their eggs on, and their caterpillars feed upon. So we have quite a few milkweeds here in Maryland, but I've selected the 3 most common species that you will find and the easiest to grow ones. And so common milkweed is, just like its name says, extremely common. It has these beautiful balls of fragrant flowers, and I just love it. It can be pretty aggressive species in some areas, so it loves like fields and things like that and grows really, really well. So if you don't want to control a species, then common milkweed might not be the plant for you. Butterfly weed is the shorter of the three species. So, and it's also the orange one. This grows really well in dry soils. So if you have dry soils and you don't want something as aggressive as common milkweed, then butterfly weed is a good alternative. And then the other thing, because it's shorter and it has that beautiful orange color, it's really nice to pair with some of those taller plants. Like liatris is a good plant to pair with butterfly weed because you get those different layers in your garden. If you have wet soil, swamp milkweed's really nice. I planted swamp milkweed in my yard because I just love the colors and the fragrance and all of that. And because I don't have those wet soils, my swamp milkweed struggles every year. And that's something to keep in mind. If you plant these plants in the wrong location and they're stressed, they're going to be more susceptible to disease and pests. So I have butterfly weed and swamp milkweed in my yard, and swamp milkweed is the one that gets hit by those orange oleander aphids every year, and it's always looking really terrible because I planted it in the wrong spot. And so eventually I'll be replacing it with butterfly weed, which is the plant that should be in that area based on my soil conditions. So sometimes you can get rid of your pest problems if you plant those plants in the right location and they're not stressed out. So moving on to some trees and shrubs, service berries are a group of trees here in Maryland. So most of them are small trees. We do have one that's kind of like a shrubby species, but it's pretty rare. So these are excellent early nectar and pollen for a number of our pollinators. They're blooming right now. They're really pretty, these big white flowers and everything. And the other cool thing about service berries is that their fruits are really helpful for a lot of our bird species. So they're high in carbohydrates and have decent amounts of energy. And the fruits are going to be out in the middle of the summer. So another name for them is also called Juneberry. And you can see the cedar waxwing enjoying some Juneberries there. So there's several different species. The two most common species is common serviceberry, which is Amelanchier arborea, and then Canadian serviceberry, which is Amelanchier canadensis. Both of those species are host plants for butterflies and moths, mostly for moth species. And again, you know, they've got those fruits. Now, one note of caution about service berries: if you have things like eastern red junipers, eastern red cedars, which are also known as junipers, in your yard, serviceberry might not be very good to plant because there is a cedar apple rust, which can jump between serviceberry and those juniper trees and affects the berries essentially on those serviceberries. So it'll get like the rust on the berries and everything, and it doesn't really thrive. So I don't really have serviceberries because I have a whole row of eastern red cedars in my yard. And so I know that the fruit is going to be affected by that rust that these cedars have. Oops. Oh, I'm sorry. I thought I had a picture of what a big tree looks like, but it's a big white tree. And if you're familiar with Bradford pears, which essentially are blooming right now too, it looks a lot like Bradford pear, but it's a natural native tree. It doesn't have that rounded shape, but it's as close as a substitute to Bradford pear that you'll get that's native and not invasive here in Maryland. Moving on to our some more shrubs, we've got the viburnums. And so viburnums are a group and they are shrubs or small trees. So it really depends on where you, which one you pick, what it's going to look like. So they provide pollen and nectar. They also have really good fruits, and they're a host plant for a number of our butterfly and moth species. So with these berries are actually going to be available in the fall. And out of a research study, they found that the viburnum berries were awesome for migrating birds because they were high in fat, high in carbohydrates, and high in energy, as well as contained a bunch of antioxidants. So this is really going to be fueling fall migration, and it's perfect that these plants are coming out when a lot of those birds are coming through. So if you want a viburnum that's short, maple leaf viburnum that I have right here, grows about 3 to 5 feet. So it's the shortest of our viburnums, and it is an understory plant. So it likes shade, part shade to full shade. And the only problem with maple leaf viburnum out of all our viburnum species is this is the one that deer also like to eat. And where I live, this grows wild. So I planted some maple leaf viburnum in my front yard, hoping that the deer wouldn't mess with them because it's out front and not as close to the road. But the deer found it, so I had to cage it anyways. But I'm still happy, and it grows fast. So I bought them last year, and they've almost doubled in size this year, and they reach that flowering potential very quickly. If you want something a little taller, cherry leaf viburnum, aka black haw, is a small tree. And so this can get 12 to 24 feet tall with an 8 to 12 feet spread. So it also has these beautiful clusters of flowers, which should be blooming very soon. And its leaves look so much like cherries. So it was really a good name for this plant. I feel like this plant's really underrated in the landscape just because of how gorgeous it is. And it is a plant that deer often do not mess with. So unlike its cousin, the maple leaf viburnum. Then we have the arrowwoods. So we've got 2 arrowwoods in Maryland, the southern, and there's, oh, I forget the name for the other one. There's viburnum and viburnum dentatum and recognitum. So the arrowwoods typically like moisture soils, and they can grow in kind of those wetland habitats and all of that. So it's the dentatum that is much more common across Maryland. So this is a good one to add in if you want one that's a little shorter that likes those wetter environments. I will say that one note of caution for viburnums is that we do have a viburnum leaf beetle here in Maryland. If you're out in the western part of the state, like in Garrett and Allegheny counties, you might be really careful to plant this. And I think it's also been found in Baltimore County, just because that viburnum leaf beetle can defoliate and kill these viburnums eventually. And as far as I know, there are no really good controls just yet for that. So it's still a very high wildlife value plant. And if you're willing to put in the work, then this is a good plant to add to your landscapes. So I'm not near where the viburnum leaf beetles are. They're probably going to spread down my way, but I feel like this plant's worth it to plant just because of how much it supports. And this is just that cherry leaf viburnum, aka black haw. So what it looks like in the landscape, just if you need that kind of visual there. The next plant I'm going to talk about is red maple, and this is a small tree. So it takes about 20 to 25 years to reach its flowering potential and full size. And it gets about 40 to 100 feet tall. So and 100 feet, that's a really big maple. So most of them don't get that big. And what I love about this plant is it's one of our earliest nectar and pollen resources for our native bees. So this is a really important bee plant. There are a lot of folks that say dandelion is the best food for them, but this is what our native bees co-evolved with. So even though it is animal dispersed, or animal pollinated, I'm sorry, it can, some of it can be wind dispersed, so sometimes it can kick up the seasonal allergies if you're like me and have those seasonal allergies. So something to keep in mind. It's gorgeous though in the spring. So it finished up flowering, but it has these beautiful red flowers that give way to these red samaras, which are the fruits that a lot of different species eat. And then in the fall, it's going to have this gorgeous fall color. So it's multiple seasons of interest with this plant. It has that nice straight trunk and really pretty growth. So this is a good plant to put in a front yard if you want a focal tree or something like that. And then those fruits, those samaras, they've got some proteins in them and all of that. So there are a lot of animals that eat them, birds and small mammals and larger mammals will eat them. So it's providing that energy, and certainly the twigs are also delicious to a lot of different critters because it being a maple, it has that nice sweet sap to it. So a lot of different species like to eat this tree, but it's still worth it to add it into your landscape. And the last but not least, I'm going to go over white oak, but we have a number of oak species. And if you follow Dr. Doug Tallamy, then you'll find that these are his top species that he recommends in your landscapes. And he calls the oaks keystone species just because of the number of wildlife that they support. So oaks overall host over 530 species of butterflies and moths. So there's a ton of species that are supported by oaks. And it takes them about 40 to 50 years to reach the age where they start producing acorns. So it's a long-term investment, but they are wonderful wildlife plants. You're not going to be disappointed. They have, white oaks in particular have really pretty growth habits as well. And they also work as kind of a focal tree species and everything. I will say that in parts of Maryland, we are experiencing oak decline, and some of that's due to a number of factors. We've had some really wacky weather, so really wet summers followed by some droughts and things like that, which have stressed out the trees, and then certainly some secondary pathogens and insects have come in and kind of taken advantage of the stress. So much like with the viburnums, plant with caution, but know that this is an extremely high value wildlife plant. And if you could only plant one thing, then planting an oak would probably be my recommendation if you have the space for it to live and thrive within. So the acorns are eaten by so many different species, and white oak acorns, because they have less tannins than red oak acorns, are usually first eaten when they drop in the fall. So they help fuel those animals for winter, whether they're migrating or whether they're hibernating, or, you know, if they just have to fatten up essentially. So this is a good plant to have. And I know that some folks are asking in the question and answer essentially how to find different species and some other tips. Excuse me, and they will be going over some of the local native plant nurseries. So one of the suggestions I always say for Maryland is to check out the Maryland Native Plant Society, because they have a list of native plant nurseries and also native plant sales that happen across the state. And this is native plant sale time. So a lot of places are having lots of sales, and it's really hard for me to focus and not spend all of my money on native plants. I'm sure when my husband looks at the credit card bill, he's going to be like, Kerry, because I've already been having a heyday. But hey, I'm doing it for our habitat and wildlife and for water quality and all sorts of things. So I'm doing it for the greater good. So check out all of that. And if you are in another area besides Maryland, see if you have a local native plant society, or check with your local master gardeners. They probably have some information on different places to access these. And there's certainly vendors online too that sell plants and seeds and all of that. When you're purchasing these things, the best thing you can do is looking for local species, those that are what we call local ecotypes. But I understand it's really hard to find local ecotypes, and it's starting to become more popular to have these native plants and everything, but it's still difficult sometimes to find what we call straight species and local ecotypes. When I say straight species, these are species that haven't been crossbred or done anything or selectively bred for certain traits. So in the plant trade, even in the native plant trade, you'll see these plants called cultivars, which sometimes are selectively bred or crossed with other species to essentially have traits that are a little more favored by people. So sometimes those cultivars are bred for mildew resistance, or for bigger, showier flowers, or to survive in drier habitats and all of that. But you should be kind of careful with cultivars, because they're being bred for human values and not necessarily wildlife values. And so an example from Dr. Annie White's PhD thesis is this cardinal flowers. So this is an excellent plant that likes wetlands. If you look at it, it's a really good hummingbird plant. And so this was crossbred with great blue lobelia to get this, this cultivar right here. And if you look at this cultivar, it has much larger flowers, and it grows in a little drier habitat than this. The cardinal flower can be kind of finicky sometimes to get to grow in landscapes. So I don't always recommend it for new backyard wildlife gardeners and all of that. So this was essentially bred to overcome some of those issues. But Dr. Annie White's research found that while hummingbirds visited this one more frequently than the straight species when grown together, this one actually had 80% less nectar than the cardinal flower. And part of that was because this one was crossbred with great blue lobelia, which is much more preferred by bumblebees than hummingbirds. And so it has different tactics to attract those hummingbirds, or to bring in those bumblebees and to feed those bumblebees, compared to something that was co-evolved to essentially feed the hummingbirds. This isn't the case for all cultivars. And certainly we don't have a lot of this research with nectar and pollen content and all of that. So I always say, if you can, the gold star level is getting a straight species and getting the local ecotype of that species. And then if you can only find, a non-local ecotype, or you can only find a cultivar, that's okay, right? So that's better than having a non-native plant, and certainly much better than having an invasive plant in your landscape. So focus on progress and not perfection, and do the best that you can with the tools that you have. And some of these cultivars might come out ahead. So some of them might have more pollen and nectar content, or higher fat values, or something like that. But right now we just don't know. So just keep that in mind. So the other thing that I want to mention is ask whoever's selling your plants whether or not they've been treated with pesticides, because sometimes these growers, to protect their investments, will treat the plants with pesticides, and that can affect who's visiting, and how, like, the food quality, the pollen and the nectar content and all of that, it might have some of those pesticides. So this has happened several times to people that I know that have purchased milkweed from some of the larger garden centers, and the milkweed had been treated, and when the caterpillars went to eat the milkweed, they died. So just something to keep in mind, and just be an informed consumer and ask those questions. For those of you who are looking for other plants to add to your landscapes that maybe I didn't cover what you exactly needed, I suggest this U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service guide. It's also at this nativeplantcenter.net. You can go there and you can hit a drop down button and say, I'm in the coastal plain, I've got sunny habitat, dry soils, and I want a shrub, and it's going to spit out different resources or different plant suggestions for you. When we think about putting it all together, I have to admit this is my weak area, because I just like to plant stuff that I like and not think about the aesthetics quite so much. But you might want to consider this, especially if you're, some people have different palates and tastes and all of that. So we're really fortunate. Howard County and their Bee City USA group put together some fantastic templates of different types of gardens for different habitats. And so they've got the little bubble diagrams and all of that. And if you go to that livegreenhoward.com/land/pollinators, this is a good website to go to, and you'll see all of the different selections that they have, and they're even in different languages, which is also helpful. And this is just an example by that master gardener, Debbie Ware. Again, you can see, she has a much more formal look. She's got native plants, but she's got this rock border, and she's got the edging and all of that. And this is helpful because if you're trying to get your neighbors okay with your wild plants and natural landscapes and all of that, think about, kind of adding those borders and all of that in, and making it look a lot more intentional when you put it together. If you're attracting wildlife, you also should make sure that they're safe when they're coming in. So right now we're in the midst of migration season. So making sure that you turn off excessive lights outdoors or put them on sensors or timers can be really important. And watch those windows and doors, those glass environments that essentially reflect your natural landscapes, because that could be a death trap for your local birds and bats, particularly right now with the migration that's happening. So this is an example of some dots that I just put up this year. So it was a tape, and my husband is there pointing out the one spot where I missed the dot. It was like these long lengths of tape, and you had to rub the tape to get the dots to stick. And I missed one, and he found it promptly. So I've got to go out there and just put that one little dot back. So there are temporary solutions, permanent solutions, cheap solutions, and expensive solutions for window treatments. So it's all based on your time and budget and everything, what you want. This tape was pretty cheap, but I had to make sure that I used straight lines to install it properly. So something to keep in mind with this was feather-friendly deterrent there. Cats also kill a lot of wildlife, and keeping them indoors is helpful for not only the cat's health and safety, but also for our wildlife species too. If you have to use pesticides, definitely avoid broadcast use, and think about limiting lawns, because the less lawn you have, the less habitat it's going to be to breed for some of those problematic species like Japanese beetles. So then you don't have to use pesticides. So I usually suggest, if you do have to use pesticides like herbicides or fungicides or things like that, just be an informed consumer. I will share some resources to a Cornell pesticide study link, and that has some really good information about choosing things. So choose it for your needs and try to reduce your impact as much as you can. And think about runoff too, what's coming off your landscapes with stormwater and all of that, and using those plants to kind of stop that stormwater and also help keep our waterways nice and clean too. So there are lots of great resources all around. I wish I could have a whole day to talk to you about all the things that are out there, but check out our Wild Acres page. And we have a quarterly newsletter called Habitat, and the next edition shall be coming out next week. So sign up if you want some articles about what's happening in backyards, some suggested plants. I have an article on the periodical cicadas that are going to be emerging like now. So all of that's in that Habitat, as well as our Wild Acres page. And check out some of our partners like Maryland Biodiversity Project and Maryland Native Plant Society and the Bird Conservation Initiative for other ways to help wildlife, or just learn about some of the wildlife that we have. And that's all I got. So I guess I will start taking some of these questions. Okay. All right, so I see a question from Sue Green about the best time to cut back stalks down after winter. And for the flower stalks, I just started taking my flower stalks down. So we usually suggest once you get a week of about 60-degree days in the spring. So usually mid-April, late May is a good time, or sorry, mid-April, early May is a good time, depending on where you're at. So I'm in the coastal plain, so I'm taking mine down now. And when I cut them down, I just lay them off to the side of my yard, just in case anybody hasn't emerged yet, because that way I don't want to compost them or throw them away when they still are developing or are just about to pop out. So those are my suggestions. All right, and I see a question about ferns contributing to feeding insects or anything. So I don't know too much about what is being supported by ferns. I feel like there are some gull midges or something like that that feed on ferns, but I will have to look into that. So that's a really good question. There has to be, some benefit to the landscape. I like to add ferns in for different kind of textures in the garden. So I've got a couple different fern species, including Christmas ferns, which are evergreen. And so it's nice to have them out in the garden. I do know that deer sometimes will eat some ferns, but not all. So they usually don't mess with my Christmas ferns, but sometimes when the lady ferns and things like that are young, they'll touch them. So. Ooh, here's another good question. You have some really good questions. So I see one from Diane, that our native honeysuckle can hybridize with Japanese honeysuckle. Do you know if it's true? And I haven't heard that. So I would also have to look into whether or not there is that hybridization. So I definitely have both. The edges of my woods have that Japanese honeysuckle, and I'm constantly cutting it back and trying to prevent it from seeding into my yard. So that's a good one to look into if there is that hybridization going on. And I see a question from Pam about the best source for plants and seeds for the flowers. So it really depends on where you're at. So I would check with your local native plant nurseries. And I know that the folks with Envision are also going to be going over some different native plant nurseries and sales that are happening right now, as well as ones that have, essentially reduced the amount of pesticides that they use on the certain plants. So look for those resources. Check out the Maryland Native Plant Society if you're in Maryland. In Virginia, the Virginia Master Gardeners have a really excellent page. And I believe they also have like a native plant page that promotes different places that sell them. So in terms of mowing down the seed pods on bee balms so they spread, I leave bee balm up. So I leave the stalks and all of that up, and I just let it seed into wherever, right around it, because that's where I want it to grow. And then also I leave the seed pods up because the finches and other things are going to come in and feed off of it. So they'll sometimes land on the stems. They'll sometimes pick off some of the insects. So I just leave things like kind of essentially how nature intends. And that's my approach. But if you want it to spread in a certain area, then certainly taking those seed pads off and shaking them around will help. So hope that helps. All right. And Carol asked, can you just dig up your grass? You certainly can. So you can dig up your grass if you want, and it just takes a lot of work to dig it up. And you just want to make sure that you kill off those roots or get it far enough down to kill off those roots. So that could be an alternative to the solarization or the lasagna landscaping or the sheet mulching and all of that. Okay, so Cheryl has bare areas from construction and she's trying to minimize lawn, but she needs other options, and you have a large area. So if you've got a large area and those bare areas, I would find, if you're interested, some of those aggressive native species that would work. So think about things like if you have the habitat that would support those golden ragworts, so putting golden ragwort in, or the goldenrods are going to be a good one that will also fill in and all of that. If you have the right conditions, you select the right goldenrod. If you want a grass, like for erosion and stuff like that, and you want it to fill in like a taller grass, sea oats is a super aggressive native grass. It's got beautiful panicles of fruits and all of that. It's a really, really pretty plant, but it is super aggressive with its growth habits. And so that would be a good one, but it gets several feet tall. So if you want something small, you might want to think of a aggressive ground cover to put out there, Cheryl. Jennifer asked, deer deterrent methods that do not involve expensive fencing. Yes, if you could actually find the perfect method, you would make a lot of money. So unfortunately, it depends on your deer. My suggestion is usually finding the best deer resistant plants for your area. So, but your deer, it depends on them. So my deer, for example, milkweed is supposed to be deer resistant because it has that milky latex sap that's supposed to be toxic. But the last couple years, I've had a pregnant doe who's visited and promptly eaten my milkweed. So that's where you have to, I suggest like trying out small numbers of certain plants and seeing how they work and seeing if that would help you with, your deer and all of that. So try to select plants that your deer likely won't touch. That's one thing. You can use some of these repellents, like the ones that are really stinky, like liquid fence and things with putrefied egg solids. You can use that as a barrier spray around some of your native plants. And that's what I was doing in the beginning. But I found when it rained, they'd come out and all of that. You can also get in touch with your local wildlife service and talk to them about different options in terms of deer management. So for some areas, our folks have suggested using essentially like a low voltage electric fence that's baited with like peanut butter. And it doesn't have to be high and doesn't have to cover the whole area, but essentially you're training the deer when they see that structure that it zaps them and they want to stay away. So that is something that some people recommend, but try out your local wildlife services. So if you're in Maryland, we have a USDA nuisance wildlife line that will talk to you about some different options. And that is another resource for you to look at. And I see a question from Wendy about the ice plant, which attracts a large number of bumblebees. Is it beneficial or not? I'd have to make sure. So the only ice plant that I know about is an invasive species, but I think of it more as an invasive species out in California. So I'd have to know kind of what plant you're talking about, because common names can sometimes be a little weird. What you might think of as ice plant might be different than what I think of as ice plant. And if it is a non-native species and it is attracting bumblebees, then the question is it attracting them and supporting them, or is it just attracting them? So I've had some discussions online lately because some of these non-native lawn weeds, like some of the non-native mints and dandelion and all of that, are attractive to bumblebees and to some of our bees. But when you look at the pollen content or the nectar or both, it's not supporting them. So like some of the non-native mints, their strategy is essentially some of the plants produce a lot of nectar, but some produce almost none. And it's just a lottery system for those bees. So some of them are getting food and some of them aren't. And so in the long run, it's not really helpful for those species. And I know we're getting at 8:15. I know there were some native plant nurseries and everything to talk about. I didn't know if you want me to keep answering questions or if you need some time to go over those plants.
We do, but you could do 5 more minutes.
Okay.
Yeah, we don't have that long to talk about, so yeah.
All right, good to know.
Answer a few more.
All right. So Maureen, locally native for my top 10 picks. I picked them for Maryland and specifically like the Frederick County region. But a lot of those plants are going to grow across most of the state. So it depends on where you're at. So if you're in, West Virginia, my top 10 picks might not work. But certainly, based on Dr. Doug Tallamy's research, those oaks and goldenrods are still going to be really important species, no matter where you are in the eastern United States. So there's likely an oak or a goldenrod species that's going to be good for you wherever you're at. And certainly with those viburnums, there's also ones that are going to be good for you too. All right, so Pam's got a ton of those bergamot seeds, and should she mow them or leave them? Well, if you still have them right now, and depending on that area, like you can cut them down and set them off to the side. You could mow them down. I don't know what you usually do with them every year. Most of my experience is with a smaller landscape, so it's feasible for me to cut them all down and lay them off to the side of my yard. But, you know, if you leave them up, like I always think of, you know, if I wasn't here, what would happen? And essentially the stalks would stay up in those fields and, excuse me, eventually would either rot away or something would eat them or something like that. So if you've got a large area and you're okay with just letting it go, then let it go and don't worry about it. But if you want it to make it look better in terms of aesthetics, then consider kind of taking them down now. And Judy asks, when you plant these guys in pots, can they survive through the winter, danger of freezing, etc.? And that really depends on the plants and the size of your pots. So my trumpet honeysuckle was in one of those really big barrel planters that was over a foot deep. It was like a couple of feet deep. So those roots were really protected and I didn't really have to worry about winter time. But it did get hit a couple years ago when we had a really droughty summer and we were out of town and we didn't water it. So it got a little unhappy because it got pretty dried out while we were away. So right pot for right plant, you know, drainage is also really important, especially in the spring and the summer when we're getting a lot of rains. So some of these plants do not like to be swamped out with all that water. So I would check whatever plant you're putting out in the pots, kind of look at what its requirements are. Think about like, you know, the depth of the roots, because some of these need those deeper pots to have their roots in for cold winters. So, and some of those might be like, you know, annuals and doesn't really matter. You don't have to bring them in at all. So, all right. All right, I see a question from Kerry. Is the serviceberry cultivar Alden Brilliance just as good or more or as a more pure native? And I don't have that information about that cultivar. So, and I could look it up on like, I usually suggest resources like Google Scholar. That's where I go to kind of get a lot of my research and all of that. But looking at the nectar and pollen content in terms of the food that it's going to deliver, a lot of that research hasn't been done for many of these cultivars. I do know that Dr. Doug Tallamy looked at some of the plants that had darker colored leaves. So if the cultivars had more of like a purplish reddish leaf compared to the native species or the straight species, then sometimes they had less herbivory on them. So like less caterpillars eating them, because those colors that the chemicals that produce those colors in those leaves also made them taste worse to the caterpillars that were feeding on them. So if Autumn Brilliance does have different colored leaves, like particularly those purples or those reds, and that's like during the growing season, then that might not be the same benefit as a straight serviceberry, but it all depends. So there's a lot of potential for research in that category if you want to do that. So somebody says, I keep planting butterfly weed and it blooms all summer. However, it rarely comes back the next year. Ooh. So butterfly weed is one that definitely comes up late in the spring. So mine aren't even up right now. And then I had to be careful because I was pulling those stalks down, and those milkweed stalks have those really fibrous root or fibrous like fibers to them, and so it's easy to accidentally pull the whole root out of the ground if I'm not careful when I'm cutting those stalks. So you know, mine have come back, but it could also be the conditions that you have, and so maybe it was okay for that growing year, but not good enough for that plant to persist in your soil. So you might want to just check your growing conditions there. All right, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so thank you, Kerry. And we are going to be showing our slide in just a second. Here we are. So the team that has been working on this webinar actually went around to nurseries in this area and asked them, we showed them the list of plants that Kerry suggested, asked them if they typically grow those plants or have them for sale, and if they were not treated with neonics pesticides. And we had a fairly short list. So these are ones that we know don't use pesticides on their plants and will have a lot of the plants that she has suggested. So Gettysburg Plant and Garden Shop, Lauren's Garden Service, Sunny Meadows Garden Center, and Surrey Brook Nurseries. Notice that only one of those is actually in Frederick County. But this is as close as we could get. All right, so there's another part of this slide. I think Bernadette is going to move. So in Frederick County, we have a few places that carry some native plants. They are not able to usually guarantee that they have not been treated with neonics. So what we are suggesting is if you go to the Dutch Plant Farm, Meadow Farms, or Stadler Nursery, ask. They may not be able to tell you the answer, but just by you asking will help put pressure on them to talk to their growers, because they don't grow their own plants. They get them from growers. And if they get enough questions asking for plants that are neonic free, they will start putting pressure on their growers. So if you go to one of those stores, ask them. And then finally, we have one more thing. There's going to be two native plant sales. There's lots of native plant sales, but there's two that we know about that are nearby. The Monarch Alliance online plant sale, and the Audubon Society, so those are two of the nurseries that were neonic free that you could go to otherwise, but you can also order during the plant sales, and they're fundraisers for those organizations. And you order online, then you go pick it up. So these are all going to be on our website. Oh, neonicotinoid, I can't even get the word out. Anyway, it's a systemic pesticide that once it is in the plant, it stays in the plant and can affect the pollen and the flowers and the leaves. So we want to avoid plants that have been treated with that. It is outlawed, as my understanding, it is not allowed for us, to just go and buy it and put it on our plants, but growers may be allowed to do it. So anyway, these will be on our website, and you will be getting a message, a follow-up message from us that will have the recording of this talk and also this resource and some other resources. So unless Bernadette has anything to add, I think we are about done. I want to thank everybody, and especially thank Kerry for sharing all her information with us, and look forward to seeing all these beautiful gardens that are going to be out there supporting wildlife and insects. Thank you, everyone. Goodbye.